Namaste friends, Hari Om. Welcome to the second part of the series on the destruction of the temple of Serapis. So I had envisaged this to be the second and the penultimate part, but what I realized was it wasn't enough just to simply have a few slides saying this was how the temple was destroyed. Uh, what I needed to give was a little bit of background of the different events that culminated in the destruction of the temple. So this was the end result, but we have to understand a lot of the background that went before. And this background will also be helpful in understanding the destruction of Sanatana Dharma in Rome itself. So let's have a look at the overall timeline of how things kind of progressed. So the timeline of the destruction of Serapion, you can think of it as having the process having started around the year 300 or nearabouts, and the final destruction, the physical destruction of the temple, happened in the year 391. And there were different players involved in this process. The first, and in my belief, the most responsible for this, was the Roman Emperor Constantine. So I've titled this the Constantinian Disruption. And in this slide, I will be talking more about Constantine, and he ruled the Roman Empire from 306 to 337 of the Common Era. And Constantine is like an asura. So he is pretty much responsible for this whole process of the Christianization of the Roman Empire and the destruction of Sanatana Dharma. And there were other players who subsequently followed. So his sons, Constantius II and Constans, so I called him the double treble. I'll be covering them in the next set of slides in the third part. And they ruled from roughly 306 to 361. They ruled over different parts of the empire. So Christianization progressed under them as well by means of laws which made Christians superior and the dharmics inferior and so on. There was one bright spot, and that was the Roman Emperor Julian. So the Christians call him the apostate, which means somebody who has left Christianity, and it's a derogatory term. And I think Islam has got a similar term. But his rule was for a period of 2 years only. But in those 2 years, he was probably the only person in history who came very close to overthrowing Christianity. So pretty much he went right to the root of Christianity and almost, you know, um, revived the Sanatana Dharma in Rome. But he was assassinated. And after that, there were two emperors, so Valens and Valentinian, again brothers, and they were kind of the status quo people. So Christians, but they didn't want to upset the apple cart by antagonizing the dharmics in the Roman Empire. So they kept on Christianizing, but they did this more subtly. Okay, but the person who kind of culminated the whole affair of the destruction of Sanatana Dharma was Theodosius. Now, I think he was really Constantine reincarnated just to finish the job. And it was in his rule from 379 to 395 that the temple of Serapis was actually physically destroyed. So, let's have a look at Constantine, who he was, and what actions he took, which made Christianity supreme in the Roman Empire. So Constantine, he's referred to as Constantine the Great because obviously he promoted Christianity, so he becomes the Great. But for us, he was simply an agent of chaos or a very evil person who pretty much destroyed all that was good and righteous in the Roman Empire. So he destroyed Dharma in the Roman Empire. And John Holland Smith, the author of The Death of Classical Paganism, which I have referred frequently in this series, referred to Constantine as the murderer of the oracles. So oracles were, the Purohitas or Pandits who had this connection with the devatas and who could predict the future and who could give you advice. And these were at all the major temples. So I think the most famous one was at the Oracle at Delphi in Greece. So Constantine wore a gentle mask. So he was a the implication is he was a crypto Christian and he kept fooling the Sanatan Dharmics in Rome by kind of saying that no, 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 I'm not completely Christian. Uh, I'm doing this for justice and so on and so forth. And he's a very good example of how just one compromised person who has got untrammeled power can destroy everything that is good and righteous in this world. So, dharma can be little wiped off by just one person with asuric tendency. And Constantine was the one who really unleashed the Christian virus on the Roman Empire. And this had a domino effect for thousands of years. So, we can pretty much put at his feet the destruction of civilizations, cultures, and the genocide of billions across the globe, even in India by the Christian British Empire. Now, the previous emperor Diocletian was a hardcore dharmic. He had suppressed Christianity and stabilized the empire. And we'll come to Diocletian in the next slide. But what's not clear is whether Constantine was a crypto-Christian, or he was brought up as a Christian by his mother Helena, or he was simply an opportunist who gravitated towards Christians because he saw them as a very useful power block in his power struggles. But the deadly effect he had on Sanatana Dharma is absolutely undeniable. But before elaborating on his actions, we need to take a quick look at the political situation of the Roman Empire in the last years of the 3rd century and the early years of the 4th century. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay. There we go. So this is a map of the Roman Empire in the first 20 years of the 4th century. And like I mentioned before, from the mid 280s, the great emperor Diocletian stabilized the Roman Empire and he saved it from imploding. There were a lot of other factors, economic, political invasions, and so on. But like a true dharmic samrat or dharmic emperor, he took Vanaprastha ashram. This is very interesting. Very close parallels with Hindu Dharma around 305 of the Common Era, and he divided the empire into 4 parts, each under an emperor known as an Augustus. Now, as typically happens, if you've got multiple successors, there is a intense power struggle. This goes on all over the world, irrespective of what religion or region you believe in. So the empire by 308, sorry, was split between 2 emperors. So Licinius in the east. So the Eastern Roman Empire was Egypt, large parts of the Middle East, including Syria, Israel, uh, the complete part of Turkey. That was the Eastern Roman Empire. So this was under Licinius from 308 onwards. And the western part, so which is North Africa, Spain, uh, France, Italy, and Greece, and a little part of Germany, well, all under Constantine. So this was the division, and unsurprisingly, another power struggle uh, between Licinius and Constantine. And by 317, after a series of battles, Licinius was comprehensively defeated. By 325, he was murdered on a trumped-up excuse, so he was hanged. And in 326, his soul his son Lysianus, Valerius Lysianus, was murdered by Constantine as well. And Constantine committed a couple of other murders. So he killed his wife Fausta and his own son Crispus as well. There was a difference between Licinius and Constantine. So Constantine, as we have seen, was a crypto-Christian or an unbaptized Christian, whereas Licinius was typical of Hindu politicians of the modern age, where it's a mix of kind of reverence for Hinduism, if we can put it that way, and opportunism as well, where they pander to the different minority segments such as Christians and Muslims in the in the hope of getting more votes. But Licinius was one stumbling block towards Christianization in any case, and he was removed as well. So let's look at the political actions that Constantine took over a period of roughly 30 years from the early 300s. So some of the first steps he took once he got power, and remember till 317, he had dominion over the western part of the Roman Empire, which is today's Italy, Spain, etc. And Licinius was in the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And after 317, he gets complete power. So he becomes the undisputed emperor of all Rome. So in around 315, so Constantine had begun the process of Christianization by his own edicts earlier, So there was an edict of Milan. So it's a disputed whether this was a proper edict or this was simply that name that these church elders gave on a later stage. But in any case, there was some kind of a proclamation by Licinius and Constantine, a joint proclamation that granted Christians freedom to practice their own religion. Now this was the starting point, and it gave Constantine kind of you can say the authority to do a lot of other things, which had a massive effect. So Christian priests were being appointed to key positions. Subsidies were given for churches. At the same time, the subsidies for the temples. Now, temples till this stage, and even when they were destroyed, were actually property of the government of the Roman Empire. So, subsidy was withdrawn from these government establishments, the temples, and was given essentially to the private outfit, which was the church. So you can easily see the parallels going on in modern India as well, in so-called secular India for the last 70 years, irrespective of whether it is the Congress or the BJP. This goes on unimpeded. No tax for Christian clergy. Same situation in India as well. And important development was that Christian bishops kind of got magisterial powers. So they got the authority to judge Christians, and they were granted equal status to dharmic priests. So all the oracles, purohitas, etc. So now you had a parallel religious political establishment coming up right next to the dharmic establishment, and the dharmic establishment was being subsequently weakened. So they were entitled to guards and lights during functions. And another key thing that Constantine did, just to show that he was a proper Christian, was he visited Rome. I don't remember the year, whether it was 325, I think, or a little bit earlier. So the tradition of the city of Rome was for the Roman emperor to participate in certain traditional vidhis or ceremonies, and he refused to participate in them. So this was a very clear signal to the clear thinking, dharmic philosophers and scholars that there was something seriously wrong. And the next phase was, just bear with me, in 318-20, where there was a more invasive attack on dharmic practices. So first edicts against Tantra. So in the Roman Empire, Tantra used to be called as, I might be getting the pronunciations wrong, theurgy and divination. Okay, so these were the terms for what we would loosely call as Tantra. So first edicts were issued against Tantra, and this included, making magic, using magic to, kind of take away somebody's life as illegal. So what we need to understand is some of the practices which were not kind of appreciated by major dharmic society. So even if somebody uses, say black magic or, some aspects of tantra to actually harm someone or do some of the baser practices like, vashikaran or something else, we don't consider that to be sattvic and dharmic. And which is why even in India you got these anti-superstition laws which kind of target dharma from the side. So they will target these what you might call unsavory practices, but their main target is always to attack the main body of dharma. So this is a kind of a back route to attack dharma. And by 319, 320, edicts were issued prohibiting private and secret divination. And all the followers of Roman dharma were told you need to go to the public temples, and whatever you want to do, whatever puja vidhi or ceremony you want to do, you do it in daylight, you don't do it at night. So it has to be done in public eye. And Christian bishops became the informal ICS, or what in British times the predecessor of the Indian Administrative Service was the Indian Civil Service. So Indian Administrative Service was simply a change of nomenclature. So Christian bishops pretty much became like this, and the earlier phenomenon was them getting magisterial powers. So you now had a parallel political institution, not just religious, political institution, which was vying for power. And the next step was really the last 17 years, from 320 to 337, where there was now a massive loot of uh, temples throughout the Roman Empire. So government agents who were supposed to maintain the temples, make sure that all the rituals, everything was going fine, the murtis and everything was intact, and if the temples needed any subsidy, they were supposed to do that. They instead started acting in like asset strippers. So they began to take out all the valuable stuff and everything from the temples. Temples began to fall into ruin, uh, and the funds were now spent on churches. So again, modern India, you got the Hajj subsidy, subsidy for Muslims, and subsidy for Christian churches. I think some states in India have also introduced the Jerusalem subsidy. So Indian Christians can go to Jerusalem on a subsidized fee. And another important aspect, which again goes on in India, so it's very funny how history kind of repeats and follows the same template, was the museumization and secularization of temples. So temples were now turned into public tourist spots. So think about Varanasi, Ujjain, Mahakal, what is happening under the BJP dispensation. And they were secularized. So the sacred element was taken out. So these were some kind of where you used to visit. And what Constantine also did was he robbed some of the most sacred temples in the Roman Empire of artifacts, statues, murtis, uh, you know, important objects, and he brought them to his capital, Constantinople. So he had kind of moved the center of gravity away from Rome to what used to be the Licinius part of the empire and to the city called Constantinople. So he used all these divine statues and everything brought out from the Garbhagruhas, and they were installed in the public places. So people could look at them as curios or objects of art rather than sacred objects. Okay, so this again modern day phenomenon happens all the time. And murtis and sacred objects were seen as decorative pieces. So you can see over 30 odd years there was a massive shift, not just in government policy, but also in how people were beginning to view the sacredness. So the sacred aspect was continually being stripped. So this was the process. And why did Constantine kind of convert to Christianity or become a hardcore Christian? This might be one answer or might not be, but I just found this quite interesting. So as I mentioned before, Constantine had uh, committed a few murders. Again, not he was not the first one to do this. So everybody, irrespective of their background, has done this. All everybody, politicians or royalty. But how you deal with the guilt? So everybody feels some kind of guilt or fear after doing these murders. How you deal with this guilt kind of differentiates you. Now, Sanatana Dharma, there is no get out of jail card. So if you do a bad deed, you kill, you hurt, see, as per the law of karma, you will have to face the consequences in this life or the next. So Constantine went to the traditional pujaris uh, and he said, I am feeling guilty because he had given the oath of protection to these people whom he had murdered. And what can I do? So what can I do not to face the consequences, divine consequences? So the priests obviously told him that there was no means of purification, there was no tradition that would enable him to perform a ritual and wash away all the karma, all the bad karma that he had incurred. But then there was a Christian bishop from Spain. So his name was Hosius. He used to be called as Hosius the Egyptian. And I'll quote this entire paragraph from J.H. Smith's book. So Hosius slid into Rome and made himself the intimate of the woman of the palace. So this is very interesting how Christian missionaries operate even today. So even today in India, when the if women are staying at home and they are housewives, they are not working. So typically the Christian missionaries come in the afternoons when there aren't any men around the house, and they try to influence the woman because see, once the woman of the house gets converted, she will influence the husband or she will influence the children. So she has pretty much a lot of power. So she's the anchor point of the house, and if you can capture the anchor point, then you automatically get control of the house. And in royalty, obviously, it works the same way. So you convert the woman of the royal household, and then obviously the next step is they kind of put pressure on the men to convert. So he confidently claimed in conversation with Constantine that what Christians taught could cleanse any crime, promising that it would immediately liberate any wrongdoer who accepted it, leaving him free from all sin. So this was a get out of jail card. And this card has been used by Christianity throughout. So Christians have committed some of the most terrible crimes. I mean, it baffles imagination, and you cannot read about some of these. But on the premise that, if as long as you go and confess, Jesus will take all the sins and you are free as a bird. But obviously, in reality, that it doesn't work that way. So the practical consequences of this policy and Christianization was that you can freeze this slide, in the presentation, because the statements are very, very important and very relevant to us today as well. So temples were in a state of ruin. Now I mentioned that government agents, instead of looking after the temples, they started stripping them. So the situation was temples were stripped of their doors, uh, so left in a very dilapidated state, and the Garbhagriha was left exposed. So if the statue was bronze, it was taken and put in a public display place, and if it had any value, then all the ornaments were taken away, stripped off, and whatever valuable was melted down. So this was to show to the followers of Dharma, look, your gods are incapable of defending themselves. We have taken the statues, we have melted them, we are going to make into ornaments or gold bricks or whatever, or gold coins, and your gods can't even protect themselves. So this is a very powerful statement, and this has been done by every Abrahamic sect, whether Islam or Christianity, throughout their history. So finally, in 337, at the age of 65, now tyrants and evil people live a long time. Aurangzeb is a very prime example, lived to the ripe age of 90. So Constantine died, and on his deathbed, he was formally baptized as a Christian. No wonder he is known as, Constantine the Great. But the destruction of the foundation of Dharma in Rome was simply completed by his successors. And I'll talk about them in the next slide. So thank you for bearing with me. This was a long presentation. And please remember to share, subscribe, and like the video. And I will see you in the next part. Thank you.